Hey guys, it's Sarah from Just My Typewriter, and I'm back with another 101 video. Now there are quite a few things that can affect the value of your typewriter. The model, the age, the rarity of that machine, the condition. One thing that can also affect the value of your typewriter, whether you're buying or selling, can be the typeface. And I often get asked about typefaces, and I know very little about typefaces, so I decided to ask an expert. I'm wearing your hoodie.
Oh, that's great. Okay. How is it? I mean, it
It's
looks
good. I
nice.
like it a lot. It's very the inside is very soft.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's good. Okay, I like soft hoodies.
I'm sitting here with Lucas of Typewriter Chicago. So Lucas, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Hi, I'm Lucas from Typewriter Chicago, and I've been repairing and restoring typewriters for almost a decade now. And, well, I don't know, do you want to discuss what we're talking about?
Yeah, so today in the Typewriter 101 series, we're going to be going over typefaces. And this is something I get asked all the time about what are special typefaces, what typeface makes a typewriter more valuable. I'm sure you get those kind of questions all the time as well. So I guess like the first question is, from a typewriter person's perspective, what is a typeface and why does it matter?
Well, the misnomer is that a lot of people would call it a font, and that's generally the closest thing that you could relate it to. A lot of people will ask me, what kind of font is this typewriter? When the technical term for what you would use that word for is typeface, and that just refers to the style of the letter that the machine prints. And I think that harkens back to typesetting, the typesetting days of movable type, what face is on that piece of type. There are two standard sizes of typeface. One's called pica and one's called elite. Now, pica typefaces, you'll generally hear these terms thrown around. You'll hear CPI and pitch. And CPI stands for characters per inch, and pitch is kind of like your point size. Now, it varies a little bit from computer. If you're talking about like 12 point versus 20 point on a computer, 20 point would be absolutely massive, but on a typewriter it would actually be significantly smaller. So I think the standard in typewriters is pica, which is a 10 pitch or 10 CPI, which means that if you type out a line and you stick a ruler on it, it's going to measure 10 characters to the inch. That's what CPI stands for, characters per inch. And for elite, that's generally 12 characters per inch, so those letters are just slightly smaller so you can fit 2 more in per inch.
So if somebody was out there and they were looking for a specific type of machine, one way they could check the typeface size would be to measure how many characters they can fit into, an inch, and the difference there would be the 10 versus 12, right?
Basically, I think the easier way would just to look at the line scale on the machine, and generally you'll be able to tell if that's pica or elite, because the line scale on a pica machine for a standard width carriage generally goes up to about 85 or 90, and you get over 100 characters on a line scale for an elite machine.
And when we're looking at like different typefaces, is there a standardized one that like you should just expect to be on machines? Are there specialty ones? What makes a machine having a different typeface? Like what makes that special?
Well, there is a standard typeface. I think everybody is familiar with, the typewriter look, the typewriter typeface. It's generally a 10-pitch serif font, and over the years that kind of evolved into what we now know as Courier, which is a cleaned-up version of that standard classic typewriter font. And Courier is a serif typeface. I don't know if we want to get into serif versus sans serif now, but basically for a serif font, if you think of Times New Roman, it has all those fancy little dangly bits on the ends of the letters. Whereas a sans serif font like Arial, thinking about that meme you sent me earlier, will have basically smooth edges on all of the letters. There's no embellishments. And sans serif fonts are really rare, or I should say typefaces are really rare on typewriters. So when you're judging the value or how special a certain face is on a machine, generally it's the rarity or how unusual it is that will make it special.
Another question I get asked a lot, I'm sure you do as well, is about script typefaces. So like the idea of what is a script typeface? Why is that different than a standard typeface that might have that serif or sans serif style to it as well?
The script typeface is the technical term for a cursive typeface, and I know you've got your Spencerian Royal over there. And that's something that a lot of people are very much after because it's incredibly unique. A lot of people wouldn't think that a mechanical device like a typewriter could create a look that mimics handwriting, and that's kind of what these machines were designed to do. Is they wanted to be able to give a personal touch to writing and things like letters and stuff. and the script typeface was designed to mimic handwriting in that way. Really early on, there were a whole lot of typeface variations. It was all more of the same, that kind of classic serif font. But as far back as, like, say, the 1920s and the early 1900s, there were experimentations with varying the line width. I have two very early type samples as well to show off. Get the light right. One of them is an 1893 Williams I, which has a very crisp or very clean style of type. And this is from a direct inking machine, which means it doesn't use a ribbon. And the other one here was a 1892 Remington Model 2, which has a ribbon, and it's a blind writer, and it gives a little bit of a thicker line variation. Now, these two examples weren't intended on purpose to be varied samples, but given that that was kind of the way things were, some people liked that. So certain machines actually developed stylized typefaces that had thicker line widths. And this is the other sample. This is a 1913 Oliver 5. And if you want to pull up a close-up of that, you can actually see that these characters are more stylized than normal. It's not just a thicker line width. You have more exaggerated serifs, more slopes, and some of the finer details of the typography. And the other one is, a Hammond multiplex, which is also a ribbon machine, but it achieves that very fine, very crisp text as a machine that doesn't use a ribbon. And those were two of the kind of the basic styles that were just thrown around. And then the other sample that I had is from 1906. This is an Oliver No. 3 from Germany. It was made in Stolzenberg. And this is an italic typeface. And I would say that italic is probably one of the earliest non-standard typefaces that came about. People wanted it for emphasis or just for a little bit of just like a light style to add some character to your work. Moving forward in the 1930s and 1940s, we had pretty much the same style of typeface, but the numerals began to change, particularly in the number 4. We had what was called open numerals and closed numerals. The open ones were, of course, open on the top. The 4 makes a little bit of a triangle, and if you had those open numerals, it opened them up a little bit. And sometimes they were larger, and these were often used for banking, ledgers, and things, where nobody really cared about the letters, but they wanted the numbers to be distinct and legible. And then after that, we started playing around with the physical size, and we mentioned the Elite and the pica pitch, but we also had other machines with slightly larger type, like this 1931 Royal P, which has a 9-pitch typeface, so it can fit one less character per inch, so it's ever so slightly larger. And these were used in school, so kids could read the page a little bit easier. And that was, of course, exaggerated a little bit with much larger typefaces, like this bulletin typeface, which is a 6 character per inch. And if we compare that, of course, to your standard pica, you can see that it is significantly larger than standard. And these are made for advertising mock-ups or for people who are seeing impaired. And that typeface actually was popular in the 1950s and 60s as well. With Smith Corona, they had their Sight Saver typefaces, which are specifically made for people who had vision problems. And then, after that, we started seeing more innovations in normal-looking typefaces, but they were specific styles specific to manufacturers. They would put out a new machine, and it would be slightly different. It would be a little bit more elegant. We can see that in 1955 with this Olivetti, and this is their imperial typeface, and it wasn't anything special. It wasn't italic, it wasn't cursive, but it was just slightly more stylized, a little bit more elegant for, most typewriters at this point were used for business and professional use, so you didn't want anything that was crazy and out there, but you still wanted something that, stood out a little bit. Royal did the same thing around the same time with all of their Quiet Deluxe lineup. They had our new flagship model of portable machines with those fancy pastel colors, and they released that with the Canterbury typeface, which looks basically like every other typeface ever, just slightly different. You'd really have to dig down in there and look and see. We got the E that's a little bit more rounded, some sharper serifs in some of the letters. And they redesigned that a little bit in the 60s with what they called Merit, which is the next type sample. The E is a little bit sloped. They took out some of the roundedness of the letters, but it still looks like that very classic typewriter typeface. 1937, going back a few decades, released Modern Pica, which was a very popular business typeface, And it's almost identical to the standard typewriter typeface, except the E is slightly tilted, kind of like Vogue, which we'll get into in a little bit. And this is the 1957 Olympia SG1 with the Congress Pica typeface. Olympia Congress was also slightly of a bolder type style, it had a thicker line width, but it still presents very nice for business and professional use. Then, of course, I know you asked about script typefaces, and there are actually multiple different classifications of script typefaces. I think you could narrow them down into two categories. One would be the inline script typefaces, which you could use on a two-color ribbon. All of the letters sit on the same writing line. Or there are the drop cap script typefaces, where you have certain letters, especially the capital letters, that dip well below the writing line. And I have two samples here from a Hermes Baby and an Olympia SF that are the inline script typefaces. One of these has, I believe it's the Hermes Baby, the capital letters are all standard capital letters, but the interesting thing about the Olympia is their capital letters are just bigger lowercase letters, similar to a double Gothic machine, which I suppose I should have mentioned earlier was a rather popular sans serif typeface from the 40s and 50s. And then, moving on to the drop cap script, we had a few categories of those that were designated by the degree of tilt of the letter. Now, back then when you were learning handwriting, you would tilt your letters a little bit. That was something, I don't know, it's something that you did. And you had 75, 45, and 90 degree script. 75 and 45 are the most common. This is an example from a 1959 Smith Corona Galaxy. And you can see those capital letters, especially the E and the C, dip well below the writing line. And it's a very nice, very pretty looking script, probably my favorite of all the styles. The only thing about that, and any of these with drop caps, is you can't use a two-color ribbon because then it starts to dip into the red section of the ribbon. And these type styles didn't appear until much later in the 50s and 60s because they're a little bit harder to manufacture. Once you get characters that are that tall, you start having to need to modify the type so it fits the circumference of the platen and prints evenly on all the surfaces. And then the final, probably the most rare of all the script typefaces, is called vertical script. And it is definitely the most stylized typeface of basically all of them. And it's so stylized that it's hard to read. And this one is from 1939. Super uncommon to have them on machines that old. So that's a rather unique one. A vertical script kind of fell out of favor because it was so hard to read. As far as super stylized typefaces, that's about it. There is the German type style called Frankter, which is kind of that old English Gothic style typeface that you see in a lot of diplomas and things. I don't have an example of that, but I do have a couple examples from the IBM Selectric in the 80s, which allowed you to easily swap typefaces, and that's kind of when people really started to use like all of these wild different typefaces. And if you pull that up, we can see the Old English, which is a kind of a copyright-free version of Frankter, as well as their version of an inline script, which is not as stylized as what appears on the manual typewriters. There's another version of script that IBM produced that is a little bit more stylized. But we can also see that we have the classic type styles, Prestige and Courier. Now, Courier was kind of your classic typewriter style that was watered down and homogenized into a business professional type style. Whereas Prestige is all those other ones like Modern Pica, Canterbury, and Imperial that was all homogenized into a standard type style that was just a little bit more elegant. And I did mention earlier Royal Vogue that appeared in 1927 and ran through the early 1930s. This is probably the epitome of all sans serif typefaces. It's a beautifully designed Art Deco typeface that's probably the rarest. And it appeared on the Royal portable machines of that era, and generally you go for like $2,000 to $3,000 for that machine.
Vogue typeface is the one I think most people are probably familiar with as like a rare typewriter typeface. These, which do you think are the most collectible? In your personal professional typewriter repair opinion, is it worth going for a Vogue machine, or are there other ones that maybe get passed over in favor of Vogue?
I'll be really honest, I'm surprised that Vogue is the one that people most commonly hear. Since it is so uncommon, very few people have actually even seen it. In my opinion, I like Vogue a lot. I really like the look of sans serif typefaces and typewriters. I think they're really cool. But a lot of people tend to glance over it. They don't like it as much because it's not a typeface that was meant for typewriters. It was actually meant for the printing press. So the line spacing, or I guess you call it the kerning, the space between letters, is a little bit off, and it makes it a little bit hard to read. If we went back to the IBM type styles, I got one on that page called Artisan, which is still technically sans serif, but it retains just a little bit of dangly things on the letters to help fill in some of those gaps, especially on like the lowercase l. But I think Vogue definitely is a hallmark for collectors because it is so unusual, and it was definitely probably the most out there experiment as far as typefaces go from that era. Script is relatively common. Obviously, it does fetch a premium price because it's not the standard typewriter typeface, but it is definitely the most popular because it's really cool, and the way the letters run together, it really does look like handwriting. Of the script typefaces, vertical script is the most collectible because it's the most obscure. And from the sense of somebody who actually writes with typewriters, I would stay away from that one because you just can't read it very well. As far as other super collectible typefaces, there is the Frankter typeface, which I mentioned before, which only appears on some very obscure German machines, and that one fetches an incredibly high premium because there's so few of them out there. And that really is a beautifully designed, very old Gothic style typeface. It's very cool. And then, of ones I didn't mention, there is what we call the techno typeface, and I forget the later word for that. That one appeared on a lot of European machines, especially the Hermes and the Adlers, and it's kind of that squared, boxy style of letters that was kind of popular in the 60s and 70s. I wouldn't say that one's particularly rare, but it is collectible. It's definitely one of the more achievable ones, and it's a cool typeface if you like that sans serif style and that, kind of 70s computery look.
So I guess that begs the question, when people are trying to value a typewriter, whether they're selling it or buying a new one, what factors in typeface can drive up the price? Is it just having a different typeface, the difference between CPI and size? Are there, how do you value that as your selling machine or buying one for your collection?
Between the two standards of Pica and Elite, I have not seen any price variations in those two sizes. There's about an even amount of both of those out there. When you start getting to micro typefaces, like 17 characters per inch, and I did send over an example of that one, that can generally drive the price up because those are used for very specific purposes, and there's not a lot of them. And then you get on the other extreme, the 6 characters per inch typefaces, like the Sight Saver for the Coronas. Those generally also drive prices up because they're obscure. When we get to machines that are made for people with disabilities, I personally try not to charge anything for them because I feel like collectors like to hoard those types of things when there are people out there who actually need them because they have these disabilities, and these machines would help them with that. But generally, any sort of typeface that's not, your specific standard is going to come at a little bit of a premium. For something like Olympia Congress or the Imperial typeface used by Olivetti, the manufacturers use that a lot, so it doesn't really impact price. Or the Canterbury typeface on Royal, that was on all of the Royal Quiet Deluxes. It doesn't impact the price at all. It was the standard typeface that was issued with those machines, and same for Merit, which was released in all of the Royal Futuro machines.
There's two things I think that I want to cover before we're done, and that would be the legibility of typefaces. I know that some people find some typefaces more legible than others. You'd mentioned that there's script typefaces that you don't like to use because they're hard to read. So are there typefaces that you think are more legible than others? And how does that factor into a consideration? And then the other thing I wanted to ask was any merch you want to plug or products you want to plug as well, your website, all that.
I wasn't gonna ask about that, but since you're pressuring me here, yeah, vertical script is difficult to read. I think that's a general consensus for everybody. There's been some rather funny misnomers and people sending letters and getting totally the wrong message. Otherwise, typefaces are literally designed to be read. The letters, the method of communication. Frankter and the Old English typefaces can get a little bit difficult to read because they're super stylized. Some people complain that Vogue is hard to read. I don't think so. I think it's just fine. I think they're just picky, but I mean, if you're definitely concerned about the legibility of typefaces, your standard typewriter typeface, or your Prestige or Courier, I don't think you can go wrong with those. As far as merch to plug, well, I do want to just kind of show off the book that I'm working on. Very excited about this. It's on the Williams typewriter. Hopefully, this will be ready for sale the end of January or early February. And I've been working on this project for a couple of years now. Just a great compendium on the technical aspects and history of the Williams typewriter, which is my favorite typewriter and has no unique typefaces whatsoever.
As Lucas was saying, there's such a variety of typefaces that you can get on a typewriter, and it can really impact how someone reads the text that you get in a letter. I remember the first time I saw Continental typeface, or Stymie typeface as Olivetti later called it, on a Underwood Golden Touch Deluxe from like the 1950s. Looking at that typeface for the first time, I was really blown away by just how different it was, even with such a subtle change as changing circles and ovals out on some of the letters. It really made me look at the typeface different, and it was something I immediately recognized. Same when I got a double Gothic machine. I didn't even know it was double Gothic until I started using it, and I was blown away by how different that typeface looks once you're using the machine. If you are interested in a specific typeface, you will probably pay a premium for it unless you run into it in the wild. Typefaces can drive up the prices of machines, so if you have one specifically in mind, like Vogue, that's really rare, you will pay more for that machine just because of the rarity of those typefaces. So it is something you might have to be really patient for and save up for if that's something you're really passionate about. But if you want to try a couple different typefaces all on one machine, you might want to go with an IBM Selectric that's been well serviced and is in good working condition, because you can get the little Selectric type elements and switch out the fonts and try a bunch of them. And I do that with my Selectric as well. Now, typefaces were on typewriters and they came from print setting, and that kind of led us into fonts. And if you're interested in fonts, there's a lot of resources out there. I love fonts from a graphic design perspective. A font can tell you so much about how you're supposed to read something. There's a reason we see things in Comic Sans and think it's funny. There's a reason your diploma has Old English style lettering, and there's a reason that New York City subway street signs all have Helvetica typeface on them, or font. It's a way that we organize information, and a typeface can really tell you how you're supposed to read that information. As Lucas was saying, script fonts or cursive-based fonts can make something seem a little bit more personal, and something that is sans serif seems a little bit more clinical, but it could be easier to read depending on where it is placed. I think fonts are super interesting, and I have a couple book recommendations for you if you're interested. This one is Just My Type. I bought it for the title, by Simon Garfield. I really recommend this book. It is the history of some of the fonts that we're really familiar with and you've probably seen places. Once you start seeing the differences between fonts, you're going to see it everywhere. Another one I have here is The Designer's Dictionary of Type by Sean Adams. This just has a directory of a bunch of different fonts that are really interesting. But again, typewriters have typefaces, not fonts. If you're interested in more information on typefaces, I do have a couple links down in the description. A couple people have found some of the typeface books that have existed out there for typewriters and have posted them on the internet, and those are really helpful when you're trying to determine what typeface you have on your machine, so I've included those down below as well. In addition, Lucas has a fantastic website, a great YouTube channel, and also a fantastic Instagram. So if you are interested in more of Lucas's content, I've linked all that stuff down below, including a link to his Williams book, which I'm very excited about. And I personally recommend all of Lucas's t-shirts and hoodies. They're super soft, they come in really fun colors, and it's a great way to kind of rep typewriter merch. And also they have octopuses on them, or octopi on them. I just think they're great, so I've included links to those down below as well. Go check out his YouTube and his Instagram. He's always doing some really cool and interesting stuff, and he's very technical in some of the things that he does, and he has a lot of knowledge. If you're interested in more videos on Typewriter 101, what to do when you get your first typewriter, and some of the basic information that you might need as a new typewriter person, please leave me a comment down below what else you might need to know from a Typewriter 1 series so I can get working on that kind of video. If you're a collector and you have more to say about typefaces, feel free to list that down below in the comments as well. What is your favorite typeface? I don't know what mine is yet. I haven't decided. If you're interested in more typewriter content, I do some other videos on this YouTube channel, and I also have an Instagram at just.my.typewriter. I want to thank you all so much for watching and remind you, you're just my typewriter. I turned on my ringer in case the mechanic calls because my car's in the shop, but my dad just keeps texting me. And so you're just going to hear all those text notifications. If you're interested in the history of fonts, which is not typefaces, but fonts are what came kind of after typefaces. That's a text from my father. If you're interested in fonts specifically, not typefaces because they're different, fonts also have a very interesting history. Again, typefaces started with